John, we find ourselves in the 4th chapter in a very well-known passage about a woman in a well. And the challenge with chapter 4 is very similar to the challenge of chapter 3. I got to teach you something you don't know, a perspective you don't have, insight you've never had before. And so it's a little daunting challenge. It's also challenging because the story of the woman at the well is 42 verses. My choice was cover it real quickly and get through 46 verses to give you the complete story, or do it the way I decided to do it, which is split it in half. So we're doing 26 verses this week and a fair amount of depth, and then we'll finish the story of the woman at the well in part 2 next week. I want to start by drawing a comparison, and this will make more sense at the very, very end, but the comparison is between the start of chapter 3 and 4, because the start of chapter 3 is Nicodemus. And he is a perspective on the lost. Our woman at the well is another perspective on the lost. And so I just want to put everybody on the same page in terms of why these two are juxtaposed. With Nicodemus and the woman at the well, they look as opposite as they can possibly be. He was the teacher of Israel. She's uneducated. He's wealthy. She's poor. He's esteemed. She's the exact opposite. Almost any gender, socioeconomic, educational, political perspective you'd have, they are total opposites. And I think that Jesus' approach to them was intentional. John's inclusion of them was intentional. But don't lose sight of the fact, even though they're as opposite as they can be, they still have a lot in common. Their similarities are, as they come to Jesus, they both think they're doing what is right. They are earnest. They are focused. They know what they've been taught about God. It's just wrong. They both took Jesus very, very literally. With Nicodemus, he's hung up on going back into your mother's womb and being born again. She's going to be hung up on the literal aspect of water that he's talking about. But they're both very clearly spiritually empty. So let's jump into chapter 4, verse 1. And it says, when Jesus knew that the Pharisees heard he was making and baptizing more disciples than John, though Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went again to Galilee. Last week, we talked about baptizing and the little conflict with John the Baptist, with his disciples. I told you that it was Jesus' disciples baptizing. It wasn't Jesus himself, but here it kind of brings to fruition what John and his disciples were worried about. Jesus was becoming such a big deal. So many people were coming to him for baptism and then going back home that he had the Pharisees' attention. The point of verses 1 and 2 is if Jesus stays put, his crucifixion is immediate. Jesus goes to Galilee because God the Father's timing was not yet fulfilled. So that's our first life lesson. Our life lesson is that our sin nature always wants to act on our own time plan, but doing God's will requires doing it in God's perfect timing. Jesus knows that. He knows he's got to go to Galilee to get away from Jerusalem. He'll go back to Jerusalem at the right time, but the Gospel of John has given us a picture into some of this work they're doing in Judea, or here this week in chapter 4 in Samaria. Now notice in verse 4, it's got a really fascinating verb. He, Jesus, had to travel through Samaria. Now, I think as you'll see as we go through the lesson, the reason that verb is there is because this was a divine appointment. Jesus went there knowing who would meet him at the well. She had no clue as she walked into her day what was going to happen that day, but Jesus did. Now, the reason he had to travel through Samaria to find her is the Jews of his day would not have done so. The map up on the screen shows the path that the Jews would take to get to Galilee. There's a bunch of Jews up north in Galilee, obviously a tremendous amount in Judea in the south. Samaria lied between them. So rather than walk through Samaria, the reasons of which I'll teach you in a few minutes, they walked around Samaria. The long route was the pretty route to go to the Mediterranean, up the coast, and then over to Galilee. The way most of them went was a less long route, which was over the Jordan River, up the Jordan River, and then over into Galilee. The most direct route, which was only about 85 miles, was just straight north. There was a trunk road, and the Samaritans had no problems using it. The Jews would not use it. For the Jews to get from Judea to Galilee, they walked around Samaria. Jesus said, I'm walking right through the middle of them. Verse 5 and 6, he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the property that Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. Now, he's talking about Sychar. Where are we? We're in Samaria. It's in the southeastern side of the province of Samaria. Let me show you some pictures. Two very famous mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. They're side by side and they create a natural amphitheater, such if you're on one, you can hear yourself on the other side. This is significant going back to Genesis chapter 12. Abraham goes here and creates or builds his first altar when he comes out of Ur of the Chaldees, and it's the first place in the promised land where he worships Yahweh. Jacob then bought land there. Jacob was buried there. Joseph was buried there. All throughout the Old Testament, we come back time and time again to Shechem, which is located right there in the middle of the two little hills there that you can see. Just off to the right in your picture, at the base of Mount Ebal, is Sychar. And that's the little village that we're talking about. In the image I've got up on the screen, the well of Jacob is off to the left side of the picture, kind of a little bit in between both of the hills or the little mountains, but a little bit more to the left of that screen. This is a picture taken from up on top of Mount Gerizim, looking over at Mount Ebal, looking down at Shechem, which today is called Nablus. If you go there today, it's in the Palestinian Authority-occupied West Bank. You can't get there from Jerusalem unless you go to the Damascus Gate and ask for an Arab taxi or an Arab bus, and you've got an Arab driver and tour guide, and then you can go in. A couple of times in the last number of years, it's been closed due to fighting, military action, but last time I checked, it's still open. But you cannot go there with a Jewish tour guide. You cannot go there on a taxi or bus out of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv unless it's owned and licensed by the Palestinian Authority. Now, to get into Jacob's well, let me give you a little bit more insight on this. We do have a very, very high probability that this is in fact Jacob's well, because as somebody pointed out to me last Sunday, you can't move a well very easily. And it's always had the name Jacob's well. Every map in antiquity puts this thing with this label right here. Now, what's interesting about it is since the 300s, about 350 AD, this has always had a church built on top of it. The picture up on the screen is from 1918, during the middle of World War I, and the buildings that were there had collapsed. Jacob's Well is the little dark area in the middle of that picture where you can see a wall behind it, but you can see all the rubble around it where there was either foundation stones or pillars that had collapsed. Dirt has blown in, and so for a number of years in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, it was just open air. At the end of World War I, the Eastern Orthodox Church somehow got permission to build over it, and they built over it. So this is a picture from 1934, which is a picture of the little grotto that they built with a church on top of it, and you can see the little concrete they built around the well hole. That is not what it looks like today, and that little grotto around it's not what it looks like. This is a picture from 1948, and this is a picture of what it looks like today. So if you go there today, the little guy that's been working there for 40 years will tell you this is where Jesus sat, this is where the woman sat. We know with absolute confidence you're within 5 feet of where Jesus stood. And I disagree with that because I know for a fact the concrete and everything around it was put there after World War II. And I also know from the collapse of the buildings that where Jesus would have been about 10 to 15 feet lower. So it's got about 10 to 15 feet of dirt and rubble on top of it. And so when you go there, yes, it's the same well. It's not where Jesus would have sat. This, just because it's interesting, is a picture from 1970. It shows that there wasn't even a roof on the Eastern Orthodox Church. Those two little things that look like tool sheds or outhouses, those are the entrance to go down below into the basement, into the grotto. So on the left is where you go down, on the right is where you come up. Today, that's what it looks like. And if you take your Arab bus or Arab taxi from the Damascus Gate, that's where they'll take you. And still, you go down on the left, come up on the right. There's a little place up above that, as far as I can tell, they never never do church services, but there's a nice gift shop where they'll sell you a whole bunch of things, including water from the well. Now, if you go down to the well, that's what it looked like, although the building's been expanded a little bit, the grotto's been expanded, but the well itself is the same concrete and the little stones that have existed since the end of World War II. And the well's about 165 feet deep, has about 15 feet of water in it. It's still picking up water from the water table, although the water table has dropped over the years. I've done some research and discovered that in the 1800s, the water level was about 65 feet. So if you extrapolate back to the time of Jesus, the water table was probably very, very shallow. Today, it's pretty deep. So if you look in the middle of that picture, you can see the spindle with the rope on it. They crank it up. They move it out of the little well. They put it in that little bucket just off to the side of it. And from there, they'll take the water and splash it around everybody's there, or fill it up in a little plastic bottle and seal it. And you can buy a bottle of water for $10. And it's the exact same kind of water that's in the tap water because it also feeds off the same aquifer underneath it. That's the stone. The little guy that works there will tell you that's the stone that Jesus touched. No, it's not the stone Jesus touched, but it's a nice one that encapsulates the well, and it is in fact the well where Jesus was. When Jesus was there, albeit lower, albeit out in the countryside, it would have looked something like this. It would have had stone and plaster. They didn't have concrete, but it would have been a stone and plaster environment where people could sit or could lean as they brought the water out that they dropped down into it. Back to our verses. Verse 6. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, worn out from his journey, sat down at the well. It was about the 6th hour. Let's take that in parts, one sentence at a time. Jesus is worn out from his journey. John does not let us lose sight that although Jesus is 100% God, he's also 100% man. Just like us, he gets tired. Just like us, he gets thirsty. Just like us, he gets hungry. So in every aspect of his being, he was 100% human. When he's tired, he's still ministering. When he's hungry and thirsty, he's still ministering. He's still singularly focused on the plan of God, even though he would rather not be doing it. Great little life lesson. Are we willing to be weary and thirsty to witness to the lost? In my experience, unless we think the sun, the moon, and the stars have perfectly aligned, and someone basically comes to us and says, tell me about Jesus, we don't think the circumstances are right in our life to go witness to him. We just rationalize in our sin nature, there's some reason not to do this. I may be too tired to do it. They may get mad at me. We can come up with a million reasons. But Jesus is, I think, emphasized here in John to be in a position not to want to do this. And he gives us the motivation, the encouragement that we're supposed to continue to be focused on God the Father just as he was. Verse 6, it says it was about the 6th hour. It's amazing what we can draw from this passage off the little bit that's said, because this is a reference to the time of day being 12 noon. Under the Jewish calendar, measuring from basically sunrise, which even if sunrise wasn't exactly at 6 a.m., it was considered about 6 a.m. And so the 6th hour would have been 12 noon. I can draw 3 conclusions about this woman that are very significant based on what is said, where she's going in the time of day. This morning, Pastor Greg talked about Jezebel. The symbolism in Revelation referring to the real woman from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, if you want to describe a woman that's not so good, you'd call her Jezebel. In the New Testament, the woman at the well. Jezebel's much worse, but that's how you would cast aspersions on a woman using an older New Testament reference. If you want to cast aspersions on a guy, you'd call him, I guess, a prodigal son, but the woman at the well would be in the same category of a prodigal son or a Jezebel. In light of what we know from the text, we can draw 3 things. Number 1, she was alone. Clearly, she's the only one there with Jesus, but I use this to describe it in a social, relational manner. She doesn't have anybody with her, and that is significant because she's coming out of her shame. She's coming at 12 noon all by herself because she is ashamed of who she is and the community that she's living in. The second point is not only is she alone, she has a shame that is deep-seated. She goes at noon when every other woman would go to the well in the early morning when it's cool, or late in the evening after you've used up all your water for the day and it's cool again as the sun is setting. The women went early and late, never in the middle of the day. So she goes in the middle of the day so she can be alone. She goes in the middle of the day because she is ashamed. But most significantly, she is an outcast. And what is significant is that she is from Sychar, and Sychar is basically a suburb of Shechem. They sit right next to each other. There are 3 wells that they would draw from in Shechem. There are 2 wells to draw from in Sychar. She walks all the way down the hill by herself to go to Jacob's well, which no one would have gone to, carrying 5 to 10 gallons of water, because that's a long way to walk, carrying 5 to 10 gallons of water, whether she had 1 jar or 2. So she's alone, she's ashamed, she's an outcast. She won't even go to the community well at morning or night. She won't go to the faraway well at morning or night. She goes at noon, so she's guaranteed nobody is there. It then says in verse 7, he's emphasizing who she is. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Now, if I just teach you this verse, you say, okay, geographic reference, check the box, thank you, Chris. If you look at the whole passage, John and Jesus do not want us to miss the significance of who she is and where they are. Verses 4, 5, 7, and 9, 5 times tell you Samaria or Samaritan. They're walking through Samaria. They're going to a town of Samaria. He meets a woman from Samaria. She asks him about why is he talking to a Samaritan woman. And then John editorializes and says the Jews do not associate with the Samaritans. So he's emphasizing this is a space or a place of intense racial, social, political conflict. To say that the Jews hated the Samaritans and the Samaritans hated the Jews is as a polite understatement as I could make. You think of whatever racial discord you can think of, you think of whatever personal discord you can think of, this is worse. This is worse than racial strife among any race you want to put together. This is worse than any social or political conflict you want to envision. This is hatred so bad that they literally would walk around the country not to have to go there, and it was against the Jewish law of the day for a Jew to talk to a Samaritan, to take something from a Samaritan, to give something to the Samaritan, or to otherwise interact with a Samaritan. It came with 700 years of hatred. After King Solomon, the nation divided. Israel divided. The northern 10 kingdoms kept the name Israel. The lower 2 kingdoms kept the name of Judah. The name Jew comes from the southern kingdom of Judah, which was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And in 722 BC, the Assyrians came in, just as God said, due to the obedience of those 10 tribes. Under their leader Rehoboam, if you came in, God said, and led the people into idolatry, led the people away from godly worship and Yahweh God, I'm going to take you into captivity. And that's exactly what he did. What you got to know is that in 722, the king of Assyria took everybody that was healthy, young, and able-bodied. So if you were strong, healthy, childbearing years, you got shipped off to somewhere in Assyria, Babylon, somewhere in Nineveh, somewhere in between. They left behind the old, the sick, and the crippled. And they brought in to the country other conquered peoples. 5 other conquered peoples they brought in and said, hey, we got a new country for you. You're now going to go live in what used to be Israel. What that did was it caused syncretism. It caused a combination of pagan beliefs and biblical beliefs that had resided over the decades and the centuries in Israel, and it resulted in a complete change and watering down over what previously had been Judaism. Today, you'll hear reference to the lost tribes. What happened to the 10 tribes of Israel, the lost tribes? If you believe Joseph Smith and the Mormons, a group of them came to America. That's not true. They all essentially just got dispersed within the Assyrian Empire, never to be seen again because they lost their Jewish heritage, they lost their Jewish identity, they lost their Jewish writings, and they just became Assyrians. Instead, those that were left behind became known as Sumerians, or Samaritans that came from this area where they were between Galilee and Judea. Because they were not welcomed in Jerusalem, they had to create their own place of worship. So they said, it's good enough for Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, it's good enough for us. So they built their own temple complex on Mount Gerizim, I showed you a minute ago. They also hated the Jews and their Bible, but they liked Moses, and so they kept the Pentateuch. They kept the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. They kept all 5 of those, although they rewrote it. They took certain parts out and they changed it. So they had their own Bible of the Pentateuch rewritten, and they rejected everything else that was Jewish. So those in Israel thought they were half-breeds, because they were. They thought they had denigrated the Jewish faith, which they did. They denigrated the Jewish Bible, which they did. So the Jews thought they were totally unclean, and not only were they were Gentiles, because they weren't 100% Jewish, they desecrated the image of Yahweh, or the teaching of Yahweh. So you had this conflict between Jews and Samaritans. That means when Jesus teach the parable of the Good Samaritan, that's like saying in 20th century America, a good Nazi, right? They don't go together. And in the Jewish mind, that was the idea. There's no such thing as a good Samaritan, which is why Jesus' parable was so profound. There's no such thing as a Samaritan man or woman any Jew would want to have anything to do with, much less sit down and talk about their eternal salvation. Verse 7, the woman of Samaria came to draw water. Now, this is unspoken, but it's profound because it captures the mental and emotional state of this woman. I've already read to you why Jesus is there and what happened with the disciples. The disciples, it says, here in verse 8, the disciples went on into town to buy food. From that, we draw one conclusion. The woman passed the disciples on her way to her appointment with Jesus. The disciples became better men after 3 years with Jesus. His ministry is just starting here. That means when they approached, as soon as they see a Samaritan woman, they would have gone to the other side of the street. Some of them would have closed their eyes and walked with their eyes closed. They wouldn't see a woman, much less see a Samaritan woman, and they definitely wouldn't have talked to her. It was a reminder to her as she went to get this water from the well, her people hate her, and her Jewish cousins despise her. So it was like pouring salt in the wound. She went at noon hoping to see nobody. And not only does she see people, Samaritans in her mind would have been better, she sees Jews who go to the opposite side of the street, won't look at her, won't nod at her, won't say hello, and just pass. So she enters the environment with Jesus around Jacob's well in emotional turmoil, hurt, probably a degree of anger, probably a degree of shame, just a mess of emotions that if you picture the time and you picture exactly what would have happened in passing the disciples, it becomes a little more clear. It is clear she is thirsty, physically and spiritually, because she is in tune with the things Jesus is talking about. She just can't see and understand, but she is thirsting for more, because if she wasn't, she would have run as soon as he started talking to her. So the fact she stays for the story shows she's thirsty for the water, and she's thirsty for the living water that he's going to describe to her. Verse 7, Jesus says, "Give me a drink." I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that this is a radical pursuit by Jesus. It is not a nicety. It's not a fortitude of, hey, wow, look who I found at the well. Let's talk to this nice lady. This is a radical pursuit. He had to go into Samaria because of her. He went after her in a radical pursuit. Number one, he looked at her. As I mentioned earlier, the disciples would cross the street and probably close their eyes because in that day the Pharisees had a group of them that were called the battered and bloody ones. That literally was their nickname. And the reason was if they saw a woman out on the street, Jewish woman, Egyptian woman, Greek woman, it didn't matter. They had this false idea of piety that says if I see a woman walking down the street, I will close my eyes until I take enough steps to pass her, and then I'll open my eyes again so that I won't gaze on her and commit lust and somehow violate one of the 10 commandments. They were battered and bruised because they walked into buildings. They were battered and bruised because they walked into other people and they fell down. So the battered and bruised in this effort to be pious would close their eyes and walk into things or people. Jesus looks right at her and says, I'd like to have a drink. Number 2, he spoke to her. It was written in Jewish law of the day, you may not speak to a woman unless she's with other family members or unless she's with a brother or friends, and you definitely cannot speak to a Samaritan. So as far as Jewish law is concerned, this was a double strike. He's speaking to a woman that is not a member of his family, and he's speaking to a Samaritan woman, which under Jewish law of the day would mean he'd have to go to the temple and be purified because that would defile him, in addition to the fact he had Samaritan sand all over his feet. Number 3, he took a drink from her. Under written Jewish law, you could not accept anything from a Samaritan. A piece of food, a drink of water, you could receive nothing because in their mind that was the equivalent of receiving a gift from Satan himself, and they would not receive anything from a Samaritan. So it is a radical pursuit. And Jesus sent his disciples away because they would have freaked out if he starts having a conversation with this woman. Next week, they're going to come back and you'll see how they react. It's not well. But he sends them away because he knows what's about to transpire, and he's got to get them away so he can go one-on-one with her. Verse 9, how is it that you, she asks, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan woman, she asks him. And then John editorializes and says, for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So he's very nice to her. He says, can I have a drink? And she basically says, I'm a Jewish woman. Why are you doing this? Why are you asking me for a drink? Life lesson here, a little teaching lesson. Jesus appealed to her kindness, but she responds defensively. She is culturalized to be defensive when a Jewish male is speaking to her because her mind is saying, he's trying to trick me, he's trying to hurt me, he's trying to get me in trouble with my people, because the Samaritans would have been just as angry with her as the Jews would have been with Jesus. So both of their people despised the others and would have hated the idea of the two of them talking. Life lesson here from her reaction. Regardless of how kind, warm, and pleasant you can be, when you witness, expect defensiveness. The people you're witnessing to come to that encounter where you start trying to share Jesus Christ, and they think you are a hypocrite. They think you are self-righteous. They think you are foolish or blind or misguided or a fanatic or whatever their worldview is, but it brings a level of defensiveness. So when you go in, a lot of times, I know from my personal experience, you can be as warm and kind and loving and pleasant, and you deal with somebody and they're just a jerk. They're just cold as ice. And the reason is they're just like this woman. They are culturally, politically, socially inclined to be defensive when you, with a different worldview than them, want to start talking about Jesus Christ. Great little life lesson. Verse 10. Jesus answered, if you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would ask him and he would give you living water. Now, 2 perspectives on this. Perspective number 1, in the language of the day, living water is a reference to a natural spring that bubbles up out of the ground. Well water underground doesn't bubble up. You just drill down into where there's water, you pull it up, and it's still. It's just in the aquifer. But a spring would bubble up. The Jews of the day, the Syrians of the day would call it living water. If you knew your Old Testament, which this woman would not because they just had their rewritten Pentateuch, but to the Jews of the day, And to John's readers, this means something spiritually significant. Cross-reference 2 verses from Jeremiah. Jeremiah 2 verses 13. God describes himself. It says, they have forsaken me, the spring of living water. Jeremiah uses the same reference again later. Jeremiah 17:13. God's language says, they've forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water, is how that verse ends in verse 13. So 2 different passages. I could show you actually about 3 dozen that describe God in the sense of water or living water or something like it. I picked these 2 because they were the clearest, equating God and living water. But the idea is water is a source of life. It's a source of nourishment. It's a way of cleansing. There's all kind of different pictures you get with water that are good when you apply them to God. Jesus used them with her as an uneducated peasant woman, assuming that she would see it for what it was, and that is something good, and like it's spring water. Now, great little digression here for us is, what are the wells of water that God has placed in your life? If we see this idea of wells in the Old Testament, it's where Moses, where Jacob, Isaac, Joseph, numerous other men in the Old Testament met their wives. It's the place where they went for water for their daily activities. It's where they went to get their cleansing. It was a place of blessing where when God wanted to bless them, he let them find a well or let them dig a well that actually found water, and it became a picture of God's blessing. In our world, I think there's some real easy parallels. For many of us, it's a job. For many of us, it's the home that God let us have. For many of them, it may be a place where we get to live, or even children. It's all kinds of different things that God places them in your life. They're not living water. They're not the essence of our salvation, but they're blessings that God give us that are blessings for us, very similar to the blessings he gave to his children in the Old Testament. But then another question is, are God's springs of living water evident in your life? So if living water is a picture of God himself, we saw that in Jeremiah, what would be our cross-reference today? Our Bibles, yes, it's God's word. Our church, the church of Jesus Christ in general, yeah, that'd be a source. Our salvation, sure. So in your life, there's evidence to the world of God's blessing. Those are the wells, like our job, our families, our houses. But are the springs of living water evident in our life? Is it evident when your friends talk to you that you have read your Bible ever? When you talk to your friends, is it evident what your prayer life means to you, or that you ever pray? Do your friends know you read your Bible? Do your friends know you pray? Do your friends know you go to church? And why? Life lesson. Our sin nature wants to throw the equivalent of dirt over the blessings God gives us. In the Old Testament, the way you would hurt somebody is you would put dirt in their well, right? It's not a spring. It's just an aquifer of dirt. You pour a bunch of dirt, you throw a bunch of dirt inside the well, it fills it up. It's no longer a well. It's just a hole with dirt in it. We, in our sin nature, do the same thing. The destructive nature we have with relationships, the destructive nature we have with the things God gives us. We throw things of dirt on top of them, somehow at the time thinking that's the right thing to do, but it's throwing dirt on a blessing God gives us. I see that manifest with guys that come to me and say, I want you to pray with me to get a new job. And I say, why? And they say, because I think it's time to move on. And it's just them. It has nothing to do with God. Or they'll say, I want you to pray with me about a new house. I want to sell mine. Why? Because I've been in it 10 years. And I'm like, so what? It's a gift from God. But yet we want to throw dirt on it just to change it up, just to make it look different, just to move it around a little bit. And that can frequently be a big, big problem. Corollary life lesson. When we throw dirt on the living springs God has given us, Bible, prayer, church, we shouldn't be surprised by the resulting mud. You throw dirt on a living spring, you're going to get mud. You're not going to get a recreated something. You're not going to get it something that looks nice. You're going to get mud. And the mud is not the fault of the water. It's the fault of you throwing mud on it. So how do we throw mud on our Bible? We don't read it. How do we throw dirt on our prayer life? We don't pray. How do we throw dirt on our church? We stop going. We tear down the pastor. We tear down the people that go there. We look for all kinds of reasons to exercise our spiritual gift of criticism, which is not a spiritual gift, and it results in mud on the living spring of God. So great little life lesson there. Verses 11 and 12. Back to our woman. The woman said, "Sir, don't you don't even have a bucket, and the well is deep. So where do you get this living water?" In her mind, this spring water. "You aren't greater than our father Jacob, are you? He gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and livestock." So she sees a well. Jesus is talking about living water, which her brain translates fresh spring water. She can't put the two together and see he's talking about something spiritual. She's locked into the physical. Great little life lesson. Jesus appealed to her curiosity when he talks about living water. She's like, "What? There's no living water here. There's no spring." She responds sarcastically. "You're not Jacob. This is a well. This is Jacob's well. It's not a spring." Life lesson from that. Because God is the only one who can open the hearts and minds of the lost. Do not be surprised when you experience confusion, sarcasm, or misunderstanding from those you're trying to witness to. You can have the most clearest explanation of John 3:16, and you'll get confusion, sarcasm, or misunderstanding. It's the realization when you share your faith with the lost, they are the equivalent of blind, mute, and deaf, and they can't get out of that state until the Holy Spirit works in their soul to change them to hear you and see you and understand you. So we sometimes will translate that confusion, sarcasm, misunderstanding as our failure. You go try to witness to somebody, and they'll be confused, and your response will be, "I'm horrible at this. I'm not going to share my faith with anybody else." Or else they'll get sarcastic with you. And you're like, "Oh, I treaded on ground I shouldn't have tread on. I'm never coming back here again." Or you'll explain something simple like John 3:16, and they don't understand that. And you're like, "If I can't explain John 3:16 to a kindergartner, I'm not even going to try on Romans and Genesis," right? And you just, "I quit." That's what Satan wants. Satan wants you to believe that it's your failure because the Holy Spirit has not yet worked to open their eyes and ears to see and hear what's going on. Verse 13, Jesus responds, "Everyone who drinks from this water will get thirsty again," pointing to the well. "But whosoever drinks from the water that I give him will never get thirsty again, ever. In fact, the water I will give him will become a well of water springing up within him for eternal life." So Jesus gives a little bit more explanation that he's talking about the spiritual. He's not talking about the physical, because he starts by talking about the well. You drink it, you're going to get thirsty again in another couple hours. But he describes something that's going to last forever. And I highlighted the word whosoever. Just like in John 3:16, it's not just for the Jews. As a Samaritan, as a woman, as a person with a really questionable past, he was saying this is available for everybody, you included, and that was the point. Verse 15, she responds again. "Sir," the woman said to me, "give me this water so I won't get thirsty and come here to draw the water." So he goes to a deeper depth spiritually. She's still hung up on her physical need. Our teaching point here is Jesus appealed to her spiritual need, which we know she has because she stays, but she's focused on her physical need. This is a huge, huge life lesson when you want to witness to your friends or the people that God brings you into contact with. If the lost cannot see past their own physical needs, they cannot see far enough to appreciate their spiritual needs. You want to share Jesus Christ with them if they're worried about how to pay their rent next month or how to buy groceries tomorrow. Save your words. buy their groceries, help with their rent. Then you can talk to them about their spiritual needs. It's the reason why when our church does mission trips, frequently we'll do medical mission trips to solve a medical need, then we share with them. It's why we'll send people in to build something. Once a school is built, then we'll share with them. We identify the need, we meet the need, then we talk about the spiritual. So many times we say, oh yeah, I got to go use my spiritual gift. I got to evangelize. The Great Commission. We rush into a situation realizing the people you're trying to witness to are worried about food and fresh water and a place to live and a way to pay their bills, and are their kids going to be safe? And unless you tackle those issues, they can't see far enough down the road to think about their spiritual needs because they're focused on next week and tomorrow. Verse 16, Jesus responds, "Go call your husband," he told her, "and come back here." Verse 17, "I don't have a husband," she answered. Now, I want to pause for a second because this seems so simplistic. Jesus knows her innermost thoughts. Jesus knows every aspect of her past. There's 1,000 things Jesus could have said. If you or I were in this situation and we knew all about her that Jesus knows about her, we would have said something different. Don't lose the lesson of what Jesus did here, because he appealed to her self-image and she responded with a half-truth. Jesus is approaching very, very delicately. He knows her situation. It's kind of like God approaching Eve saying, "What happened?" When God knows exactly what happened. He's looking for honesty. He's looking for feedback on their willingness to be truthful about themselves with him. She's hung up on that. She gives a half-truth. Some great little life lessons here. If a lost friend cannot be honest with God, do not expect them to be honest with you. Usually the way we want to witness is we want to find somebody that's got a lifestyle that we find abhorrent. They've made choices we don't like. They do things we don't like. They say things we don't like. And we see ourselves as a part of their salvation. So we say, I'm going to fix them. And we rush into it and we want to preach salvation to them and we want them to confess their sin. And if they're not being honest with God, they're not going to be honest with you. If it's not a problem with them and God, it's not going to be a problem with them and you. So what you see as something in need of salvation, they don't see something in need of salvation. Notice how Jesus responds. Jesus responds in verse 17 and says, "You have correctly said, I don't have a husband." And then he very gingerly and delicately says in verse 18, "For you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." Now, you got to understand a little bit of Jewish culture, because even in America, if you look at somebody that's been divorced 5 times, you could say, okay, I get it. In Jewish culture, it's even more significant. Women had no legal rights. A woman had 0 ability to get a divorce at this day in this place. That means 5 different men were married to her, lived with her, knew her, and for whatever reason said, "I cannot stand to be with you, go away." That happened 5 different times. If you don't think to a woman that lacked the ability to walk out of a marriage that was devastating, you don't understand this woman. We don't know what the cause was. She's portrayed as Jezebel-like because of some kind of immorality. She could have been the most upstanding, moral person we know. All we know from the story is 5 men said, "I cannot live with you," which would have just decimated her emotionally as well as financially and probably physically as well. But Jesus very, very delicately said, "You've got 5 husbands. When you said you don't have a husband, what you said is true." Teaching point. Jesus did not condemn, shame, or exploit her sinfulness. If we were in the same situation, we probably couldn't help ourselves. We, at one end of the stream, would have been judgmental. We would have been our own little version of Pharisees to her. Or at the other end of the stream, we would have been so overly emotional and let me hug you and let me talk about your situation. Let me talk about how bad it's been for you. And whatever we would do at either end of the spectrum, neither is what she needed. It's interesting to me that Jesus still found a way to compliment her. She told a half-truth, and rather than call out this person who was an emotionally fragile egg, Jesus found a way to compliment her and say, yep, what you said was true. He held back by saying it wasn't completely true. He just communicated to her, ma'am, I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly where you are. I know exactly what you're going through. Life lesson. Our own attempts at condemnation or shame make the lost angry, want to run away, or both. If your idea of witnessing is the layman's equivalent of fire and brimstone because of someone else's life choices, they will hate your guts, run away, or both. We are not in a place to call out somebody's lifestyle choices, morality choices, or anything else. We're called out to love them as Christ loved, as seen through this woman, which is delicate and very, very sensitive, recognizing they are very hurt people, even if sinful people. Verses 19, Sir, the woman replied, I see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, yet you Jews say the place of worship is Jerusalem. He drives into the core of her bad self-image. He has put himself right in the middle of how she sees herself, and she basically says, what do you think about that mountain? Jesus lovingly appealed to her past failures, and she tried to change the topic. She tried to change the subject. And when we witness, our lost friends do the exact same thing. Life lesson. Satan will do everything possible to distract or misfocus the lost to prevent them from hearing God's truth. I'll be witnessing people. They'll know where I went to college, and they'll suddenly want to change the topic and talk about Baylor. I'll be witnessing to somebody, and I'll be talking about, John 3:16, and they'll want to talk about creation in Genesis chapter 1. I'll be talking about, Romans chapter 3, and they'll say, hey, let's talk about this weird stuff I've heard from the book of Revelation, right? They just want to go off on all kinds of different paths, and it's a tool of Satan to keep his own. Satan will fight to keep his own. So if Satan's going to fight to keep his own, we've got to realize when they want to misfocus, misdirect, misgive attention, just like this woman, there's a spiritual war going on that we can't fight. God has to fight Satan for us. It continues in verse 21. Jesus told her, believe me, woman, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews. Verse 23, but an hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father and the Father in spirit and in truth. Yes, the Father wants such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Now, I put all this together because there's a lot right there. She's distracted. She didn't want to talk about her horrible self-image and the 5 men that left her and the guy that she's now living with outside of marriage, because she didn't get married again. She's not going to let another guy hurt her like that, but she'll live with a guy. She wants to talk about the mountains where they worship. And Jesus scratches the itch. And he says, there's a day coming when your people aren't going to worship here and the Jews aren't going to worship in Jerusalem. Now, we know that's 40 years in the future. When the Romans obliterated Jerusalem, they also obliterated Sychar and Shechem. They obliterated everything in Israel. There was nothing left except rubble. So where the place where this woman's people worshiped was obliterated by General Titus, everything in Jerusalem was obliterated by General Titus, and everybody who was able-bodied got hauled back to Rome. Jesus doesn't digress. He just says, don't worry about it. There's a change coming. He says God's people worship him in spirit and truth. So I want to take just a few minutes and say, what does that mean? When it says worship in spirit and truth, what does it mean? Because if I just stop right there, your brain will jump to somewhere that's probably not right, just based on the way we think. I want to start with the etymology of worship, because in English, in the 21st century, that has a certain mental connotation to you. The etymology, the source of this word, think back to Geoffrey Chaucer. Think back to William Shakespeare, like 14th, 15th, 16th century English. If you find the way they wrote about church, it was worth ship. WORTH hyphen ship. It got shortened over the centuries to worship, but worthship was a way of saying I am giving honor to, I'm giving praise to, I'm fellowshipping with that which is worthy. Worthship was recognizing I am worshiping that which is worthy to be worshiped. So teaching point for this woman, physical location of worship is a secondary concern to God. Did he identify a temple in Jerusalem we wanted to be worshiped? Yes, but they violated that centuries before. The Spirit of God had left that place 5 centuries earlier. They still had a temple. It wasn't what God wanted. So whether it's our physical location here or anyone else's physical location, that's of secondary concern to God. Now let me say as a point here, I am not teaching that coming to church is irrelevant. I had a great uncle and great aunt that had this belief. They had a pastor that sent them cassette tapes, and their idea of church was listening in their home living room by themselves to the church preacher tapes, listening to them for an hour on Sunday, turn them off, and that was their church. No fellowship, no Bible study, no interaction, no prayer ministry, no encouragement, just them and somebody that they tithe to at a remote P.O. box. Now, if you're a pastor without any church overhead, getting tithes from people that like your tapes, it's a financial windfall. For the people in the church, it's a bad idea. I didn't think that was a church. So I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying physical location of worship is a secondary concern. That's why you can have worship in a church under a tree if that's the only place you can worship. It's why you can be in a great building like we have here. It's saying it's a secondary concern. The object of worship is primary in heaven, right? Get out of the earthly world. You get to heaven, you say, what's worship like? Your brains would immediately go to the right place. It's about honoring God. If your brain goes there in heaven, when you think about heaven, why can't your brain go there on earth? It had become secondary in Samaria. It had become secondary in Israel. It becomes secondary in our world. There are people who believe that the only place where worship takes place is where they're used to going to church. And in their mind, God doesn't exist anywhere else on Sunday mornings except the address of where they're used to going to church. And the idea of somebody going to some other church is borderline heresy, and they don't think God shows up there except maybe on a rebound when he's done at their church. We've got to remember that it's the object of worship that's primary in heaven, so it ought to be primary for us here. Now, let me teach you what it means to worship, now that we understand it's about worship in spirit and truth. In spirit. I want you to think about something you probably haven't thought about, and that is the triality, or what I put up on the screen, the triune nature of man. We've all got a body, we've all got a soul, and we've all got a spirit. For most of you, you probably treat as synonyms soul and spirit. They are very different. They're different biblically, they're different metaphysically, they're different scientifically. Body is the easy one. Soul, as Christians, we can wrap our brain around a little bit more, but soul, when we describe it biblically and scientifically, is the place of personality. It's the place where you become evident. It's where your emotions come from. Spirit is that aspect of you that defines the essence of who you are. It's not your personality, it's the core behind your personality. It's not the emotions that come out of you, it's what drives those emotions like a cornerstone of love. So if you realize there's body, soul, and spirit, I have a spirit that can understand the spiritual and can communicate spiritually. I have a soul, a personality, the essence of who I am. And both of those things go to heaven. Both of those things are with me eternally. The only thing that's not eternal is my body. It dies and we bury it or cremate it and it goes away. Now, apply it back to our lesson. The woman at the well was into bodily worship. Where do you worship? She's skipping soul. She's skipping spirit. For her, it's just a question about physical body location. Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem or some other place that this guy would tell her about. She thought it was Gerizim, and he said, nope, that's wrong. Second point, worship is not a feeling or emotion. Those two things come from the soul. In the 21st century, because of the influence of the charismatic Pentecostal movement, many people in modern-day Christianity equate overly emotional experiences as a good worship experience. A good worship experience can have some emotion. I'm not saying people don't get emotionally impacted when God works in their heart, but it doesn't have to be emotion at all. Emotion is not a check on whether or not someone has had a good worship experience. Let me give you a cross-reference. Philippians 3, verses 3. For we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit and rejoice in Jesus Christ and have confidence in the flesh. Don't get hung up on the circumcision part of the verse. Get hung up upon how Paul talks to the church at Philippi about worshiping God in the Spirit. What does that mean? What does it mean when I come to a place bodily and I feel some emotion? How do I worship God in the Spirit? Let me give you 2 quotes that explain it in a few words better than anything I could ever explain. William Barclay, great biblical commentator, wrote this a number of years ago, but it's so on point, I just wanted to read it. The genuine worship is when man, through his Spirit, attains to friendship and intimacy with God. True and genuine worship is not to come to a certain place. It is not to go through a certain ritual or liturgy. It is not even to bring certain gifts. True worship is when the Spirit, the immortal, the invisible part of man, speaks to and meets with God, who is immortal and invisible. If that doesn't make sense, think about a spiritual connection with a person. Think about your spouse. Think about a child or a grandchild. That's more than a physical relationship. That's more than 2 souls that recognize each other. That's a level of intimacy at a spiritual level where you understand that which is more than the external. You understand more than that which is more than the personality. You understand what drives someone, their core spirit. That's a little picture of what Barclay's trying to say. Other cross-reference from C.S. Lewis. I'm sorry this is a little bit small. I'll read it in case you can't. C.S. Lewis says, as long as you notice and have to count the steps, you're not yet dancing, but only learning to dance. A good shoe is a shoe you don't notice. Good reading becomes possible when you need not consciously think about eyes, light, print, or spelling. The perfect church service would be the one where, almost unaware of, our attention would have been on God. That's like saying, like, your shoes and your reading is a matter of transcending the physical. You're just in it in a spiritual, mental way. He's saying the same thing ought to be true for church. So if you can relate to a spouse or a child or a parent and that kind of spiritual connection, it's saying that type of intimacy is what Jesus is talking to this woman about that worship is. It's not singing. It's not learning. It has components of that. It's intimacy. It's opening yourself up. It's being vulnerable. It's being open to hear what God has to say to you through the teacher or the preacher. Now, that's in spirit. What's in truth? We could do another whole lesson on this. Quick summary. Approach him truthfully, which is, I'm coming with open arms. This is the center I am. I'm going to approach him biblically, which is how he wants, not like this woman got hung up on, do I worship at Gerizim or Jerusalem or some other place. And it's Christological. I'm worshiping through Jesus Christ. What Jesus told me about worship, I'm worshiping the person of Jesus and the Godhead. I'm worshiping in truth. Now, John is going to pick this idea up later. This is just an introduction. I'm going to remind you of this in a couple of weeks. In Spirit and Truth, I had to tackle because we were here. We got to jump on here real quick because the woman has one more response. She says to him, I know the Messiah is coming who's called Christ. When he comes, he'll explain everything to us. So Jesus explains all this about worshiping in spirit or truth, and her response is, the Messiah is coming. He's going to teach me what I really need to know. So she's saying to Jesus, I'm sorry, mister, I don't get it. Teaching point, Jesus appealed to her yearning to be right with God, but she tried to delay. She said, I'll just wait till the Messiah comes, whenever that's going to be. Jesus answers in verse 26, and he says, I am. In English, we add the word he. Jesus utters the first of his 36 I am statements, which we're going to do multiple lessons on, and he says, I am. And then in English, it says, I am he, the one speaking to you. In Greek, it's ego eimi, and it's I am, and it's echoing God's word, the angel of the Lord's word to Moses. When Moses says, what do I call you? And Jesus says, or the angel of the Lord says, I am. It's Yahweh. John is going to pick that up and give us numerous other references to I am, and he's going to give us 7 pictures of I am. The Good Shepherd, the way, the truth, and the light. He's going to give us all kinds of different things about what our I am, and we're going to talk about those in a different way than Greg did when he wrote his I am book, which is a great book. But we're going to do a big study on I am, but the first reference in the Gospel of John is right here. Quick application, and we're done. I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that this woman is in the Gospel of John for a reason. And it's not just to give us a story about a woman with a really bad self-image. It's because she is the first Gentile conversion to Jesus Christ. John is writing before, chronologically, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They just focus on the Galilean ministry. They skip the Judean ministry. The first convert they refer to came later in Jesus' ministry. Jesus starts with Nicodemus to appeal to an erudite Jew. We like to think we can relate to Nicodemus, smart, wealthy, educated, well thought of. That's how we like to think of ourselves. John chapter 4 is in here so we all see ourselves as this woman. This woman is the prototype of me and you. We read John chapter 4 as a picture of us. We go to the mirror and we see something that usually is not us. The mirror gives a reflection of us, but I picked this image on purpose because we look into the mirror and we like to see something different. And John is here to give us an accurate mirror. We may think we are better. We hold ourselves out when we come to church as different. In reality, we are just like this woman. To a world that looks in the deepest recesses of your past and my past, they see as much sin, if not more. They see as bad of a self-image. They see as much rejection. They see as much broken, wishful, I wish I could change that and go back and do it differently now. We're all that woman. I end with a great little verse from Ezekiel looking forward to what Jesus is teaching this woman. Ezekiel 36 tells us exactly what Jesus is telling this woman. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all of your uncleanliness. You could add past, present, and future. And from all of your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put in within you. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. What's the takeaway? We can't do it ourselves. This lesson is not a matter of will. This lesson is not a matter of properly seeing myself in the mirror. This lesson is seeing ourselves the way this woman came to see herself and saying, all I can do is point everybody to him. He saved me. He changed me. He took me exactly as I was in all my broken, screwed up, messed up past. And he loved me to be his child. Now, if you like that, come back next week. It gets even better. If you didn't like that, give me another chance because it gets even better at the end. So we'll continue the lesson. It goes on through verses 42, and I think you'll like it next week as we continue. Let's close in prayer. Jesus, we thank you so much for the chance to come and study your lesson to this woman at the well. We thank you for teaching us. We thank you for the example. We thank you for loving us. We thank you for dealing with us when we were as unlovable, as unacceptable, as unimpressive as this woman was. And you picked us for reasons that we cannot understand. You loved us for reasons that we cannot fathom. You saved us for reasons that we cannot rationalize. And we just say, our Lord, thank you. Thank you for making us different. Thank you for making us yours. Thank you for making us people that can be your light in a very, very dark world. Lead us and guide us until we're here again next week. In Jesus' name, we ask all these things. Amen. Thank you all. See you next week.